Hey everyone, this is a really well-known game, but I really wanted it on my channel. So this is AlphaZero as white and Stockfish as black. So we have knight f3 by AlphaZero, knight to f6, c4, b6, d4, e6, g3, bishop a6, hitting the c4 pawn. This is some kinds of Queen's Indian. Queen c2, c5, and now d5. E takes d5, c takes d5. Right now, black cannot take on d5. If knight takes d5, queen e4, check's gonna win here for white. Because you're attacking the knight and it's a check. So the only way to defend the knight and stop the check is to block with knight e7, but then white just takes a rook on a8. So therefore after c takes d5, not knight takes d5, but bishop b7, putting more pressure on d5. But actually it's not AlphaZero's intention to keep the pawn on d5 here. White just sacks the pawn with bishop g2. And after knight takes d5, castle, let's have a look here. So white's lost a pawn, but actually is really well ahead in development now. Just because white's castled, black's king's still in the center here. And there could be some pressure up this diagonal in the future from white's bishop. But the main thing to understand here is, when white played the pawn to d5, black took with a pawn on e6. Black played e6 takes d5, and now that there's no pawn on the e file, there's no pawn to defend the square d5 anymore. And also the f5 square is quite weak now that black does not have a pawn on e6 to defend these squares. And those squares are actually going to be really useful for white in the future as outposts, and also controlling the d5 square. If you can stop black from pushing this pawn to d5, this pawn on d7 is just going to be backwards and weak. So let's see what happened here. We had knight to c6, rook to d1, hitting the knight, getting on that open d file, eyeing up at the d7 pawn, bishop e7, and immediately let's make use of the hole on f5 here. With queen f5, if rook takes d5, it looks like a free piece, but actually, after knight to b4, black's going to actually end up an exchange up because it's a fork and they're going to win the rook back. So therefore, after bishop to e7, not rook takes d5, but queen f5. And now you really are threatening to take the knight on d5, so knight to f6. And now e4. And I think this is a really nice move because it really graphically shows, without a pawn on e6, look how much control white has over d5 and f5 now. This is really useful. This pawn on d7 cannot push to d5, and therefore it's going to be backwards and weak for ages. It's a chronic weakness, so this is always going to be bad for black. And yeah, in this position, AlphaZero obviously didn't like how much control white had over d5 and f5, so they played g6, trying to control f5, hitting the queen. Now some dark squares have been weakened though, and keep that in mind for later. We have queen to f4, castles, and now AlphaZero thinks, well, why not push again? Let's control those dark squares that have just been weakened with e5, and I think black's really suffering right now in terms of space. They are a pawn up. Objectively, maybe their position is okay, but it's so much easier for white to play, and black's just on the defensive here. So we have knight to h5, queen to g4, rook to e8, and knight c3. We have queen to b8, quite an odd square for the queen, knight to d5, bishop to f8, sensing that the dark squares need to be defended here, and black couldn't really take e5 because after knight takes, queen takes, knight takes e7 check, and after you take back, white wins the bishop on b7. So therefore after knight d5 we have bishop f8, opening up an attack on e5. Look how strong this pawn is, controlling these squares. d7 is still super weak, and also black's just general dark squares are really bad right now. And this bishop is really kind of critical for black to keep a hold of. So that's why they moved it to f8. We have bishop to f4 supporting this pawn more. Queen to c8, and now h3. And this kind of shows that white's in control, that they're able to just make this little move h3 here, that black really doesn't have much to do. Like, just the lack of a pawn on e7 or e6. Once again, I just want to stress, just look how weak these dark squares are. Black's got so little space. This e5 pawn is critical for white. And let's just do a little comparison of minor pieces. If you look at the knights here, this knight and this knight, you could say they're pretty equal. But compare the knight on d5 to the knight on h5. The knight on d5 is such a good piece compared to it. d7 is still super weak, and in general, I just think black's super cramped right now. So we have knight to e7 trying to trade off that strong knight. The knight goes back to e3. White doesn't want that to happen. Bishop c6. And now rook to d6. Going into that lovely weak square, and here the pressure is going to mount on d7. Black would love to move this knight on e7 right now to open up an attack on the bishop, but this just cannot be done. The knight really doesn't have anywhere to go. So black decides this knight on h5 needs to be retreated to try and get to a better square. Rook f6, queen b7, bishop h6, knight d5. Finally, black gets a trade, which is good, I suppose, if you're down in space. We have knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook d1, getting that last piece into battle here. Knight e6, but now white manages to trade bishops here. I guess black wanted to trade pieces because they're down in space. But the main thing that you have to realize here, white has still got this pawn on e5. This pawn on d7 is still weak. White still has super good control over d6 and f6. So all the really important things for white to keep long term, white has managed to keep. And I think AlphaZero is winning the strategic battle here. Black's positions maybe got a little more room now because they've traded some pieces. But overall, it's still a really bad position, I think. So queen to h4, bishop c6, queen h6, rook on a to e8. The other rook comes into d6. And now bishop takes f3, trading again. And we get this position. And white could take d7 here. But instead, AlphaZero decides that this d7 pawn's not going anywhere. What AlphaZero really wants here is just total dark square domination. So what it actually does is try to get this h pawn up to h6 just to control this square on g7. Because it feels that that's a really strong thing to do. So h4 is played here by AlphaZero. Queen a5. The rook comes back to d1. c4. The rook comes to d5. Queen e1 check. King g2. c3. b takes c3. Queen takes c3. And now h5. One step closer to the goal. We have rook to e7. And now AlphaZero looks at the position and decides that, yeah, let's be honest here, all white's pieces are really good, but this bishop could be better. Alright, it's going up this diagonal here, but maybe there's not so much to do up this diagonal. And if we look at black's position, what's weak? Well, f7 and d7 are weak. So let's try and get this bishop to put some pressure up on f7. So we have this maneuver here, aiming to go to b3 where it eyes right up this diagonal. Queen to e1, bishop to b3, rook to d8, rook to f3, queen e4, the queen comes back to g2, and now there's more pressure on d7 again. White is ready to push the pawn up to h6. We have queen to g4, and now bishop d1. So going off that nice diagonal, but it's just a useful move. It means that black can't really take on h5. G takes h5 is obviously just bad, and so is queen takes h5. Both of them are met by this move, rook takes f7, opening up an attack on the queen from the bishop. Discovered attack. So after bishop d1, we have queen to e4, but now h6. And you can see the graphic representation. Look at the control of the dark squares here. These two pawns are doing an absolutely amazing job right now. And still, this lack of a pawn on the e file haunts black just due to these dark square weaknesses. We have knight to c7, rook to d6. So black can take e5 now, but obviously AlphaZero decided that wasn't a problem. In the game, Stockfish played knight to e6. But let's have a little look here what happens, some lines. If queen takes e5, well, rook to e3, hitting the queen. The queen has to move and still defend the rook on e7. So queen g5, but now after f4, the queen's got nowhere to go. And black's going to lose material here. If rook takes e5, we have rook takes d7, rook takes d7, and now queen takes d7, attacking the knight and attacking the pawn on f7. And black doesn't really have a good way to defend this. The only logical move is rook e7, but queen d8 check is played. And now white's just going to win material here in the long term. Rook to e8. If you play knight to e8 here, then bishop to a4, and black's just absolutely, they're just stuck, paralyzed. Black can't actually really do anything here because the queen can't move anywhere because it has to maintain the pin on the rook on f3, and it also has to defend up here and defend the knight, so that wouldn't work. So after queen d8 check, rook to e8, but then queen to f6 actually just wins. You could take the knight, but this just wins because you're threatening this and mate. So after rook d6, black cannot take on e5, so knight to e6 was played. But now bishop to b3, getting back on that nice diagonal. Okay, black took on e5 now that rook e3 doesn't like attack through to the rook on e7. But obviously, AlphaZero decided it was worth it to open up this long diagonal up here. Rook to d5, and now queen to h8. Now this is an odd square for the queen, that has to be said. We have queen to b4, knight to c5, and here AlphaZero just sacrificed the exchange. Rook takes c5, b takes c5, queen to h4, hitting the rook on e7, and rook on d to e8 was played, and now rook f6. And all of a sudden, that queen is locked in on h8, and there is nothing black can do about it. Absolutely nothing. We have rook to f8 here, defending f7. The queen goes to f4, a5, g4, and I think the following position that we get here after the move g5 is one of the most amazing in chess history. I just want to say a little bit about this. We have Stockfish here. This is like one of the strongest chess engines in the world, if not the strongest at the time. And it's got a queen trapped in on h8. Black is completely paralyzed here. And just think how strong this chess entity playing black is, and how it's been completely destroyed. In my opinion, this is one of the greatest positions in the history of chess. And white's just completely winning. a3, queen f3, rook c7, queen takes a3, and now black had nothing better to do but just take this rook off. But obviously they're just lost. These are the last moves, and in this position Stockfish resigned. So this is an absolutely amazing game. That position with the rook on f6 and the queen on h8 is one of my favorite positions ever in chess. So I really hope you enjoyed this game, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.